I would like to request all professionals and top management to sponsor their professional employees to join our forthcoming AACE certification courses. Today's technical webinar will focus on how to choose the most suitable methodology to assess construction schedule delays. And our guest speaker is Dr. Nour-El Imane Bouhou, PSP Vice President and at ASLPM, who is also a project management, project controls, and construction claims and litigation professional. She has assisted over 35 clients across the US and overseas. On the proactive side, she provides scheduling and change order evaluation services on a large-scale mixed-use projects, infrastructure projects, as well as military projects requiring DoD cost-loaded schedule reporting and time impact analysis requirements. She also performs schedule delay analysis, productivity impact assessments, damages quantification, and serves as a testifying expert. Dr. Nour also provides technical training to owners and contractors related to scheduling best practices, project control principles, and claims. She is an assistant professor at California State University, East Bay, NKU College of Business, and the University of Houston, teaching construction management and project control courses for the undergraduate, master's, and MBA program. She also serves as the regional director at AACE International and the program chair for the Western Winter Workshop. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope this webinar will be beneficial to you for your professional experience. Dr. Nour, this is your floor. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ghassan. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I hope that everyone's doing well. Thank you again for having me here. Appreciate the invite, and I look forward to spending the next hour or so, plus your questions here with you. So, and thanks again, Ghassan and Larry, for the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in a minute. Hope everybody can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Let me move this far. Thank you again for having me, everybody, and I'll go ahead and get started. And if you have any questions, as Ghassan and Larry mentioned, please put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring, and if Larry and Ghassan can help me with that as well, the chat, to see if there are any questions that I can address either as we go through or towards the end. So as Ghassan mentioned, we'll talk today about how to choose the most suitable methodology to assess construction schedule delays. And so, as an introduction, as we know, most construction projects, and specifically the most complex one, the large one, that have multiple stakeholders, large size and so forth, have suffered to a certain extent or magnitude schedule delays. And so generally the burden comes to or is bared on the schedule analysts and schedulers, or forensic analysts, whatever we would like to call, to determine which methodology first to choose and then assess those schedule delays. Oftentimes, that type of methodology or the type of the schedule methodology is determined in the contract, but a lot of times it's not, especially when it's on the forensic side. And so in this presentation, we'll kind of go through, first of all, what is the challenge exactly with determining or choosing the right methodology to choose to assess the schedule delays, but also what are some of the things to keep in mind as we make those determinations and assess those delays. So we'll start with the challenge demonstration. Obviously, each claim or each issue that resolved or resolved around a schedule delay analysis is unique, because each project is actually inherently unique. And any schedule delay methodology that is chosen anyways, no matter how reliable and meticulously implemented, can actually fail if the input data is flawed. So we'll talk about some of the validation elements to schedule forensic delay analysis that are important to understand. And then we'll start discussing one of the, I would say, really useful tools, forensic schedule analysis recommended practice. Some of you might be familiar with it for AACE members. If you have access to AACE resources, you can download it. It's the AACE recommended practice 29R03 that walks through the different types of methodologies, the MIPs in particular, or the method implementation protocols, and then some of the requirements to the analysis for each one of these. And we'll go through essentially, in terms of steps, what are the steps to such analysis, and what are some considerations and factors to take into consideration in choosing that methodology. So I'm going to start with a few definitions, just to level set. I know most of you are going to be familiar with these nomenclatures or terminologies. We'll start with the critical work. That's a certain amount of work or type of work or scope of work that must be completed at any given point in time, so that the completion of the project does not slip to a later time. The contractual completion of the project does not slip. And when a project is actually scheduled using the critical path method or the CPM scheduling method, the critical work is identified as the work that is on what we call longest path, or the critical path, being that longest chain of activities determining the project completion date and driving that completion date. So any type of delay to those critical works would delay the project. When I'll talk about non-critical work, that's the work that can be delayed a certain amount of time without affecting the completion of the project. Certainly just a certain amount of time, because there is a slack in there, an amount of slack afloat. For people more familiar with Primavera, P6, or other software, Slack, if you're using Microsoft Project, you're more familiar with that term. Additional definitions that I want to kind of go through, that I'll be talking about, the idea of an as-planned and the idea of an as-built. So an as-planned wouldn't necessarily just be the baseline schedule, but it's any network of activities that represent the manner in which the project is planned to be executed. So it's the way the project is planned at a certain point in time to be executed or performed. That's going to be my as-planned network. So that could be the initial schedule, the preliminary schedule, the baseline schedule. It actually also, in certain situations, as we'll go through it, for Windows analysis, for example, I'll still call a schedule update in as planned. It represents at a certain amount of time, at a certain point in time, the plan at that point to perform the work. And then an as-built network is the network of activities that represent the manner in which a project was built, just like the terminology that stipulates. Another definition is, and something I'll be differentiating between, is the retrospective analysis versus proactive analysis. So there are other, recommended practices, other papers that talk about proactive analysis, and there are two types of schedule analyses. There's, as we, initially when Hassan was presenting, I do both proactive and retrospective or forensic. The proactive is as the delay is either occurred or hasn't occurred yet. A retrospective forensic is an after the fact review. So after the delay event has already occurred. So a retrospective analysis, or also called the forensic delay analysis, is an after the fact type of analysis of a delay event that has already occurred, which actually provides that advantage of hindsight on the information, the as-built information. At that point, when you're performing the analysis, the delay has been already performed, and therefore you have that advantage of knowing when the delay started, when it completed, what are the steps towards, or around that delay. And a static will differentiate also in our analysis, or the types of analysis, the static delay analysis method and the dynamic delay analysis method. So the static delay analysis method is going to focus on the measurement of performance against one single as-planned network. Again, whether that be the baseline, which would be your approved as-planned network, or be a revised baseline, an RBS, if you're familiar with the naming, a rebaseline schedule, or be a certain update that you want to look at that analysis starting, but that's going to be your as-planned network versus that as-built network. So most of those static delay analyses are really looking at and focusing the measurement against one single as-planned network versus this dynamic delay analysis, which is a delay analysis method that actually involves measuring the performance using approved contemporaneous schedule or different schedule versions. Those are going to be your schedule updates. And so with that in mind, one thing I wanted to start with, certainly with any forensic analysis, there's certain steps to such forensic analysis. I'll put this down here. those steps, starting with, well, first of all, any forensic analysis in my mind starts actually with a merit review. Whether you're on the contractor side or you're on the owner side or you're the third-party consultant doing schedule delay analysis, you want to look at, if you don't mind muting yourself, if you're not speaking, thank you. And I'll monitor the chat here real quick. And I'll go back to the specific questions a little bit towards the end. But we start with the merit review generally, is what is the contractor or the owner's merit or entitlement to that delay analysis that is in question. And then the next step is validating the data that is at your hand, your source data. Thank you. Sorry about that. And so some of the, as I mentioned, the second step after the merit review is to validate your source data, the data that you're going to be using, which are mainly your schedules. That's going to be your as-planned schedule, as-built, your schedule updates, your contemporaneous documents as well. That includes actually your progress reports, daily reports, your correspondence, and so forth. But in terms of forensic schedule analysis, because it's schedule analysis, it'll focus mainly on schedules. So start with the baseline schedule selection. What is my baseline? What's my as-planned network? And also, can I validate it? Is it a valid, reasonable, reliable schedule to start with? And that's also going to actually determine what type of analysis can you use. If you don't have a reasonable baseline that you can't rectify to a reasonable extent before it becomes reasonable, and I'll probably not use a schedule delay analysis that relies heavily on the baseline schedule. Then also look at the as-built schedule. Do I actually have an as-built schedule in this for this project? Oftentimes, and a lot of times, the answer is I might have some as-built schedule, but I need to check the as-built information in the schedule. That's the validation process. So you validate the sources of that as-built by looking at the correspondence, the daily reports, progress reports, what happened in the project that validates the as-built schedule. Potentially reconstruct it if you don't have an as-built schedule and validate it. And again, if you don't have an as-built schedule at all, that you can't reconstruct it because you don't have a reasonable set of contemporaneous information or data to have a good reliable as-built source, then again, I wouldn't probably use a methodology that relies heavily on the as-built schedule. The as-built but-for is one of them, and we'll go through that in a minute. The third also thing to look at are the schedule updates, the contemporaneous update, the interim schedule, the progress schedule, whatever they're called in your contract. And so validate those. Are they reasonably, reflecting the as-built at any certain point or that data date? Are they actually reflecting also reasonable forecasts at that specific data date? Do I have enough schedule updates to tell me the story of the project? Do I have, are they reliable or to a certain extent enough to where maybe if I can rectify them, they'll be reliable? And also, if I don't have any schedule updates, can I actually reasonably reconstruct those schedule updates? Oftentimes, if you don't have schedule updates, it's going to be really hard to reconstruct it. So again, that will determine whether or not you can use a methodology that relies heavily on schedule updates. That be, for example, a Windows analysis. For folks familiar, the 3.3, 3.4, 3.5. I wouldn't probably go with that methodology if I don't have any schedule update. And then as I respond to these questions and validate these baseline as-built and schedule update, I need to identify and quantify the discrete impact events and issues. And that's where choosing, as I understand those source data and their availability, choosing the method is going to be very key to properly identifying and quantifying the discrete impact events and issues. So now, again, I think I've talked briefly about the challenge demonstration, but I'll dig into it a little bit further. And as I mentioned earlier, every delay claim is pretty unique and can often result in significant costs associated with settlement costs, with the different type of analysis. Expert analysis is one of them, for example, with legal fees being that attorneys have to be involved in these situations. So it's a pretty expensive endeavor. And each claim is unique in that each claim deals with a different project, obviously different contract documentation, different requirements within those contract documentation, different legal jurisdiction. Some jurisdiction have specific requirements as to timing, for example, of what an expert report is due, different dispute resolution mechanism and types of dispute resolution mechanism. Does a contract call out for a mediation, for an arbitration, for straight litigation, a dispute resolution board? All of these will help you as a scheduling analyst, as a forensic analyst or expert in determining what really the answer would respond to is which methodology can I not use? Point. So I'll give the reason for that in a minute. The reason for that being that if you have, for example, a clause for mediation that states that if a claim or an issue arises or dispute arises between parties about a delay issue on the project, that these parties are required to request or required to go through mediation, to a mediation being trying to resolve things before going to any court proceeding within a certain amount of days, 30 days or something. Then you probably have to choose, if you want to have an answer of what is the quantum of my delay analysis as a party and who's responsible for that, you probably have to provide that answer before that mediation date. So that will determine which methodology to use, because some of them are more time consuming than others. The windows analysis being one of them, for example. The 3.7, which is the retrospective time impact analysis, is one of them as well. Those take a little bit more time in understanding the issues, in modeling those issues, and understanding the causation and drawing conclusions. The other one is also if the contract requires a dispute resolution board or arbitration or anything like that. All of these will determine the level of detail, not just the timing, but the level of detail you need to give to this analysis. So if you're dealing with a project that's going to litigation, you probably want to use, now generally will give you enough time to do an analysis that's detailed, very detailed. You probably want to use a method that's a little more dynamic than, for example, just an as-planned versus as-built, especially if the project is a long project that went on for years. Because being in a court situation, a litigation situation, you'll be questioned as an expert or a scheduling analyst about details on the project, about the reason for choosing that methodology and so forth. So I'll go with the more robust dynamic analysis, and we'll talk about some of those dynamic analysis. One of the considerations, I would say, and factors to take into consideration is the nature of the delay as well. Does your delay activity, or whatever that delay is it reflected in the schedule? Can you identify from the schedules that you have which activities were delayed and which are not? The other one is the availability of documents. So as I mentioned earlier, with those steps in rectification and validation of data sources, is if you don't have, for example, schedule updates, that's one data source at all, and you can't really reconstruct them, it's going to be really hard to use one of the analyses where you're going to need to use contemporaneous schedule updates. So that's automatically going to remove your ability to use that methodology from there. If you don't have a reliable, I would say, as-planned schedule or reliable baseline schedule, then you probably can't use, for example, an impacted as planned, because that's heavily, literally the name says it, it's heavily relies on the as-planned network and is impacting it. So you can't use that methodology. So the first step, I would say, in addition to looking at the contractual requirement, whether the contract says anything about which methodology to use, which frankly, most of the time it doesn't, at least here, in the US, it doesn't state specifically which methodology to use. Sometimes when you're dealing with proactive analysis, so time impact analysis, one of them, it could be, it could state something like, well, if you're asking for time extension as a contractor, use a proactive time impact analysis, and the step of such are X, Y, and Z. But oftentimes the contract doesn't really state which methodology to use forensically. Now, 3-4 years in the project, what can I do to forensically analyze my schedule delays? Most contracts are actually silent on this topic. Some contracts I've seen, which are generally the government, US government contract, the Army, Navy, those type of contracts would include some clauses about which source to use to determine the analysis. So they'll actually refer to the AACE 29R03 RP, but they won't tell you which MEP to choose. So that will be the discretion then of the expert or forensic analyst or scheduler. So I would still start with the contract requirements as the first, determining factor, but most of the time it doesn't really give a clear answer on which methodology. The next one is that do you have schedules to begin with, which, it could be surprising that projects don't have schedules, but it happened. I had to deal with projects that, while had some version of schedules like PDF schedules or look-ahead schedules, didn't actually have native formats of schedules. So in that situation, it'll be hard to perform any type of modeling, for example. So that's going to completely remove my ability to do any modeling techniques that are listed in the RP29R. Whether I have contemporaneous updates, like I mentioned, if I have schedule updates, if I don't have schedule updates, can I actually use any type of methodology that use those updates, windows, and so forth. And the multiple-based TIA, retrospective time impacts analysis, probably wouldn't be able to use those, right? And also, I would answer the question, what is the purpose of my analysis? Is it one for negotiation purposes? So maybe for negotiation purposes, I'd lean towards a simpler analysis that gives me a general range of magnitude of my delay. So probably, maybe, if the project is not too complex, I'd probably go with an impacted as planned or an as planned versus as built on the observational side. Now, if I'm going to mediation, I might want to make things a little more specific and more accurate, right? So I'll go to the next level of analyses. If I'm using observational and I have updates, I'll probably go with a windows. If I'm using a modeled, I'll probably go with a multiple, and I have updates, I'll probably go with a multiple base, the 3.7 and so forth. So the purpose of the analysis, why, and the size of the dispute, am I actually in a dispute or just negotiating? Is it just a change order situation? All of that will determine the type of level of detail and accuracy I want to go as far as this analysis. The other very, very important factor is going to be the complexity of the dispute and the budget that is allocated to do this analysis. So if I have a very complex dispute that is multi-million or $1 billion type of dispute, and I have hundreds of $1,000s as an expert to do an analysis, again, I'll probably go with a much more specific, accurate analyses and the dynamic that being if I have all the data. If I don't have enough budget and the client is typically, I just want you to give me the rough order of magnitude, I'll probably go with the simpler methodology. The other one, as I mentioned earlier, is the time allowed for the analysis. Some analyses are a little more time consuming than others, especially the ones requiring the updates and requiring the review of the updates and the validation, rectification, and so forth. Those will be a little more time consuming. And going back to, the targeted accuracy, the forum of resolution, audience, and the legal and procedural requirements will also be a determining factor. As I mentioned earlier, if I'm just dealing with trying to negotiate things with whether I'll be with a contractor or owner, just negotiating between, on this dispute, I'll probably, go with a less time consuming, less complex analysis as opposed to if I'm in a full-blown litigation. But again, the choice of the method, if everything's equal, if you will still be subject to the analyst. One analyst from another having the same type of information, the same understanding of the project, it's dealing with the same project, same contractual requirement, might choose different methods. And it goes back to the experience of such analyst. It goes back to the comfort level of, having done a certain type of analysis multiple times. And actually, you can even use 2 different methods at the same time if you elect to as an analyst. And I've had this situation in the past where it's actually dealing with a multi-million dollar claim representing the contractor on an international project. And it was a military project, actually. And So we were given certain representations by the contractor who I was representing on the issues on this project. So, you know, when we're dealing with this issue from the owner is, you know, delaying our ability to deliver X, Y, and Z. And so they're giving you a list of issues. Certainly when you're dealing with these, you know, type of projects that are complex, large, you know, international, there's social and, you know, cultural differences part of it. You have to be careful as an analyst or third-party analyst or forensic analyst to use the facts as opposed to representations in general. And so while I was getting valuable information from the client, which again, in this situation is the contracting team, it's pretty, you know, natural that it might have been biased because it's using their understanding and their representation of what occurred at the time. And so what I had to do is I wanted to use a modeling technique because the contract calls for generally model technique. So I used actually a 3.7, which is a retrospective TIA, or essentially a multi-base TIA, time impact analysis, or impacted technique, which essentially, and we'll go through in a minute, breaks down the period of analysis into multiple windows or periods, but instead of observationally looking at what happened in every period, you're actually modeling in every period the issues. So it's a multi-base TIA, if you will. And so because I only had one side of the story at the time, and I wanted to get an analysis that's somewhat independent and truthful, if you will, and representative of what occurred, I actually used an observational method to begin with, because that allowed me to understand and observe the schedules, you know, at different times, the updates and so forth. Observe what are the delays actually that occurred, to which activities the delays, or which activities were impacted by delays and so forth, and what could have been the reasons for those delays, and then went back and modeled those delays in the schedule to see, you know, what really the impact of those issues on the completion timeline or deadline. So in that time, you know, given that the source of information, while it was generally reliable, I wanted to essentially double check and make sure that I'm including all the issues that I can in the analysis. I started with an observational 3.3 for people who are familiar, the ones that looking at still windows, but observing the as-planned network and comparing it to what happened to it in the as-built sense, and go into the next window, same thing. To understand the delays in each window, and then at the end of it, went back and modeled those issues in the schedule. So in that sense, you're using two different methodologies to double check that you're actually not forgetting, if you will, and especially that the stake, if you will, was pretty high. It was a very high dollar value in terms of dispute, very high profile clients and so forth. So it helps you in terms of accuracy, increase that level of reliability to the method. And so I'll walk through the MIPs or method implementation protocols, and then we can go through the questions and address them appropriately. Because I know I've talked about some MIPs in here. For those who are familiar, the folks who are familiar, you know, you might have seen those, you know, MIP 3.3 and so forth. For others, they're probably, you know, not that familiar. So generally, what I've been using, and most of the industry actually have used, is a recommended practices called RP29R03. And again, if you haven't had the opportunity to review it, I think this would be a great opportunity as a follow-up to this presentation to just kind of look at it, refresh, and go back to this presentation, and maybe you'll be able to connect a few of these things that I'm discussing here. And so essentially it breaks down methodologies for forensic delays in different layers. So we're going to start high level. It starts with, you know, the layer or the first level, which is timing. Am I dealing with a delay that already happened? That's retrospective. Or am I dealing with a delay that I think it will happen? So because, for example, I know I'm going to have late delivery of a certain equipment due to COVID or other reasons, I know that there'll be delays to my construction works because of that. So that's basically your foresight. You don't have hindsight yet. You don't know if it really is going to happen, but you have an understanding that will likely delay. So that's the proactive. So it breaks down methodology for delay quantification into whether it's proactive or forensic or retrospective. That's the first class, if you will, or level. The second one is going to be the basic methodology, which is, am I actually doing any modeling? Am I taking schedules, changing them, rectifying them, modeling, issues in them or things like that? Or am I just observing the issues within the schedule, observing how things change from the as plan, situation to the as-built condition? That's the second level. The third level is now specific methodology. That's where the MIPs, if you will, the naming of the MIPs start coming in play. Those are your, for example, your gross period analysis or gross analysis, the as-plan versus as-built is another term, versus a Windows analysis. Those are the specific type of methods. And then you have their basic implementation. And if you go to the RP, it actually has a basic implementation protocol, and then an enhanced implementation protocol, specific implementation protocol. That meaning if you want to go in further detail, if you want to be a little more accurate in the way you're implementing the analysis, you can go to the specific implementation. So that classification looks like this. And it only for 29R03 looks at the retrospective side. So in the first layer, it only focuses on the retrospective because that's the idea of forensic analysis. So on the left here are all the methods that are called observational. And it's called that way because you're not in this type of methodology, you're actually not modeling anything. You're not changing things within the schedule. You might do some rectifications to the actual schedules, but you're not actually modeling the issues in those schedules, whether that be the baseline or the updates. And it differentiates the observational into static and dynamic. And we defined those two before, right? The static logic is when you're only using one single as-plan network to compare or to compare the performance against. Versus the dynamic is when you're using those contemporaneous update, those different versions of the schedule. And within the static, you have the 3.1, 3.2, those are the as-plan versus as-built that only use, for example, the baseline against the as-built and looks at how the critical path essentially incurred any delays. And then the dynamic logic, there are different types. The contemporaneous one, the 3.3, 3.4, which essentially breaks the period of analysis into windows, whether that be all the periods. So if you're looking at schedule updates, generally schedule updates are progress or updates on a monthly basis. So with 3.3 or 3.4, if you do all periods, you're looking at every single schedule update, and every single month is a period or window. You can also group the periods, and you can look at, for example, the first 3 months, that's one period or window, then the first and the third, the next 3 months and so forth. So that determination, it also is subject to the discretion of the analyst. So you get the thought, it's all in the discretion of the analyst is how, but it depends on a few things as well. The grouping of the windows. It depends on, for example, how did the critical path shift? If you have a sudden shift to the critical path, generally when I note that I might want to break my period there, right before that critical path shifts. If you have a drastic change in the substantial completion date from 1 month to the other, that also might be a place where I want to break my period. Another, so that's essentially the big two, I would say. Or if you have an understanding that an issue started within a certain month. So if the client or just my review of the schedule shows that there is a specific big issue that occurred within a specific month, I might break, essentially make that a break to my periods if I'm grouping them. Then you have the 3.5, which is a modified, reconstructed update. That's when you're making changes to the updates, not necessarily modeling the issues. So that's the observational. You're looking at, you might reconstruct a little bit your schedules, your updates, your source data, but you're not modeling the issues. You're rather observing how these issues occur and evolve on the schedule. And then you have the model, which is essentially, you're actually, instead of just reconstructing the update, you might reconstruct the update, but also want to model the issues in the schedule. Also want to put an issue, add activities to the schedule that represent the issue, rerun the schedule, and look at what that issue did to the entire network. to your schedule and completion date. And there are different types of methods. There's the additive and the subtractive. The additive ones, are known 3.6, 3.7. The 3.6 is the impacted as plan. It uses just one single network or single base. That'd be the as plan schedule. The as plan could be the baseline schedule or revised baseline or re-baseline schedule, but it's one network. You're taking that network, inputting all the issues chronologically. Could be global, but you could also do it, step by step. You do one issue, insert one issue, rerun the schedule, look at the impact, note it, insert the other issue, rerun. That's a step. Or you could do global insertion. I'm going to input all the activities in the schedule that represent all the issues that I know of and run the schedule one time chronologically. Or you could use a 3.7, which is the one I was mentioning earlier. It's a type of Windows, but it's a modeled Windows, if you will. So you can divide the period of analysis into multiple periods. That could be monthly or group in different periods. And in every period, you're taking the first schedule, your as-planned schedule in the period, inputting the issues or the model FragNet representing the issues in them and running the schedule, looking at what that does to your schedule. And then you move to the next period, inputting the issues that occurred during that period in the schedule, in that as planned, which actually is the as built in the previous schedule, and rerunning it and so forth. So these methods are adding FragNet activities. The subtractive method is actually subtracting activities. So you're actually removing from the schedule the activities that represent delay, or you're reducing, if you will, you're technically removing, but you're reducing durations of activities to reflect what the duration would have been, what the schedule would have shown, but for, that's why it's called also but for schedule analysis, but for that delay, what could have been the schedule completion date. So let me go through actually the questions here on my side and see if, are there any questions from from Hassan or Larry that I haven't seen? Let's be commented on that. So 3.6 and 3.7, they're actually pretty reasonable analysis. And the question here is, how can we assess spacing or concurrency in a 3.6 and 3.7? And those methodologies are going to be rather okay to understand concurrency. I would say the 3.7 might be a little bit easier for concurrency and pacing understanding. And concurrency and pacing are never an easy endeavor to determine, whether in observation or in additive. So the reason they're going to be okay to do the analysis because you're actually inputting those activities in the schedule. So let's say you have an owner delay that's concurrent to a contractor delay. Let's say a contractor is supposed to deliver some material on time, and owner is supposed to approve some design so that, while we get the design, the materials on the site, we could start construction. So you have essentially in a literal type of concurrency, they're happening in the same time, so they're literal. These two delays are concurrent. So if the owner didn't delay the issue, the contractor would still be delaying, the issue and so forth. So it's like two issues happening at the same time. So the way you would model them essentially is you insert first an issue. You can do it in a stepwise fashion for that specific period. You can input the activity representing that extended duration delay to the delivery, for example, of a certain material, run the schedule and see what it does to the completion and note that. In the same schedule, I could also insert the next issue, if you will, or FragNet that will represent now the contractor delay, the owner delay, which is the lack or untimely approval of design. So I would input another activity that represents the extended duration of design approval and observe, rerun the schedule, observe the result. If you have a same completion date, then you're having a certain, it means that the two delays are effectively concurrent. You could do it the other way. So I've done this in the past where I would actually change the order of inputting those issues. So I'll go back, recopy the schedule, whatever that update or schedule that I'm using, insert that now the owner delay first, then the contractor delay. And if you're talking about, if your question is, that means that those two delays are concurrent then, if you have the same result, meaning you insert the contractor schedule, it delayed the project, you inserted the owner issue, it delayed the project with the same amount. Then what you're going to do is look at what the contract says as far as concurrency. Some contracts are specific as to how to deal with concurrency. So I've seen contracts where they have concurrency of pacing clauses that says if an owner calls a delay that is concurrent to a contractor delay, you can't treat that as a float, and you have to, essentially you're not getting time or money. Then, I mean, while you are noting in your analysis that there's concurrency between an owner delay and a contractor delay, that intuitively you might think it's not the contractor's fault, because no matter what, he couldn't have gotten the owner's design approval. So even if he provided the material on time, he couldn't have been able to start construction. The contract just says differently. Now, most contracts actually don't say anything about concurrency or pacing. So in that situation, what we've seen done most commonly is, if you have that situation where you have an owner delay, which effectively is what you'd call, if you classify it in terms of excusability or compensability, if it's an owner delay, it's an excusable compensable delay. The contractor is excused because it's not their fault, and they're compensated because it's the owner's issue, owner's delay. And if it's a contractor delay, it's typically not excusable, not compensable. What I've seen done when the contract haven't said anything about concurrency, that you don't know how to classify these, the rule of thumb is to essentially say, well, these two kind of cancel out, and the result is going to be that specific delay quantum is going to be classified as excusable, non-compensable. So you're giving the contractor time, but you're not necessarily giving them money. So that's generally, how I guess I would classify those issues when you're dealing with a 3.7 and a 3.6. And the modeling will help you see which portion of the concurrency is concurrency that's driving and that's not. If you kind of flip it on both sides and use the stepwise analysis every time. You could also do the global insertion, but that wouldn't tell, the global insertion wouldn't tell you which one is really driving. That's the issue. And you'll have to see at the end of that analysis which one ended up driving. After you insert those issues, is the owner's delay driving, or is it the contractor delay driving? Now I'm talking about completely separate scopes of work. So it gets complicated, and honestly, there isn't a one answer that will fit all for the issue of concurrency and pacing. But again, what I would say is look at the contract first. Does it say anything about concurrency and pacing? If it doesn't, depending on the methodology, 3.6 and 3.7 will allow you to do to a certain extent, if you do it a stepwise fashion, to understand concurrency and pacing. But you'll have, again, to be careful as to how to insert it. A lot of the issues with those methodologies, because they're modeled, a lot of the opposing sides will say that, and we'll talk about it actually in a minute here, that there is some manipulation that could be done. Because actually, in some situations, inputting those models in different order might give you different results, or versus putting them in one as a one global insert. Okay, so looking at the actual MIPs, I'll go through the considerations and strengths of each methodology, and if you have any other questions, I'll look at them towards the end. But we'll start with the static. Remember, we have the proactive and retrospective, and we have the static versus dynamic, additive versus subtractive. So the static is essentially comparing the performance of the project against one network. So essentially comparing the plan, longest path, and you could look at the near paths as well, to what happened to that longest path in the as-built condition. What is the actual actual completion of those activities? It is a methodology that, or there are methodologies that are suited for projects with a rather short duration, because with projects that have a longer duration that go on for years and more complex, the critical path, we know that changes pretty significantly. So it wouldn't be very suitable for that type of projects. It's also suitable for projects with minimal logic changes. So projects that the contractor didn't have to change too much logic in the updates as we're going through. Otherwise, that means that the contractor were changing their means and methods as they're going through the project, which makes the use of the static method a little inappropriate. It's also very easy to present and understand because it's essentially simply looking at the as plan and comparing it to the as built, and graphically you can present it pretty easily. It's simple to implement. It takes a little less time than the other methodology. So in those situations that we've talked about where you don't have enough time and you don't have enough budget to do the forensic analysis, this one could be appropriate. Again, for short duration project, not a lot of logic changes. And it can be performed with basic schedules. Again, that requirement of what source data do I have? I have an as-planned network, an as-built network. I don't have a lot of time. I don't have a lot of money to perform as a third party, if you will, this analysis, and I'm just trying to negotiate. Maybe this as-planned versus as-built is a good methodology to use. But it's not, as I mentioned, suitable for projects with a long duration or projects that have been built very differently from the way they were planned. And those are the complex ones, the ones that are likely to be built differently from the plan. And it also doesn't consider critical path shifts. They're not dynamic. They're looking at just one network, comparing it to the as-planned version of it, and it doesn't consider any shifts or changes to the critical path. Now, on the dynamic side, the advantage is that, and those would be, for example, Windows analysis, right? And that whether that's as is, split, or modified, it's breaking up the period into different periods or windows, and it's looking at, for every period, a baseline schedule, comparing that and doing an as-planned versus as-built, if you will, within that window. So comparing the baseline to schedule update number 1, whether that's in month 1 or in a few months, that's going to be the difference between using all the periods or grouping the periods. And then move into the next, understanding the delays and the quantum of the delays, move into the next period, looking at the update number 1, comparing it to the second one, and so forth. So it's doing a Windows, an as-planned versus as-built for every single window, and understanding the changes and delay issues within that period. It is, the advantage is it's a widely accepted method in different legal proceedings, whether that be mediation, arbitration, or other types of legal proceedings. It relies on contemporaneous schedule updates that are approved and familiar to all the parties, and it accounts for the dynamics of the issues, the dynamics of the critical path. That's why it's also recognized, especially for complex project and project with long durations. And you can also, assign the delays and gains for these specific issues, for these methodology to specific activities, because you're looking at discretely from one period to the other. But it cannot be used or implemented if you don't have schedule updates, or if your schedule updates are not reliable. Hence, what we've talked about at the beginning, the first steps being having to determine what type of source data you have and how to validate that source data. And if your validation exercise shows that those schedule updates are not reliable, you probably should not be using the dynamic analyses. And you also couldn't be implementing it if the as-built information is not reliable. Now, assuming you have schedule updates that are relatively reliable, but the as-built information within that schedule is actually not, then you might need to either reconstruct that as-built information or build your own as-built. But in that situation, I'll be careful as well. And the other consideration to keep in mind is, unlike the static methods that are not as time-consuming and not as cost-intensive, the preparation of the dynamic logic, especially when you have to do any reconstruction or modification, are going to be very time-consuming and very cost-intensive. So, keep that in mind as well. The next group of analyses are the additive, whether that be, a single, that's the 3.6 or 3.7, for example. Those are the single being the 3.6 impacted as planned. That's when you insert, all the issues globally or in a stepwise fashion within one single network. That be the as planned network. So this graphic kind of represents it here. It doesn't only apply to the owner caused events, obviously, it applies to all types of events, but essentially you're inputting that fragnet or series of activities representing those issues in one schedule, rerunning the schedule and looking at what that does to one, the completion milestone, but also to the critical path and quantifying it that way. If you're doing it in a multiple, in 3.7, for example, multi-fashion, then that'd be similar, essentially doing this exercise, but for every period. Breaking out, again, the creative performance into multiple windows and repeating those exercises, the impacted as planned exercise for every period. It's more suitable for identifying and quantifying potential delays. That's for on the proactive sense. And it generally doesn't account for concurrent or pacing delays, but it might be hard to perform. I would say it is possible, but it's a consideration to keep in mind. It's easy to understand and prepare generally because it's a modeling exercise. You don't really have to overly observe or analyze the schedule. It doesn't require as-built schedule, contemporaneous schedule update, and that be specifically for the single one. The consideration I would say is that it's generally seen as a hypothetical model because it doesn't record, essentially, it doesn't record all the true information, if you will, the way they happen in the update. But I think if you follow the enhanced protocols, there are ways to explain those differences potentially and avoid this consideration in particular. It is susceptible to unintended manipulation because of modeling, and that's what I referred to earlier, is sometimes the order in which you input those fragnets could impact how you analyze and how you draw your conclusions. So you have to be a little, if you're doing an independent analysis, maybe as I mentioned, you switch the order and try to see what that does, and that might create some issues, but generally you're presenting one side or the other, so hence that unintended manipulation side. It doesn't, when you're doing the modeling, you're not generally in the modeling exercise accounting for logic and duration changes of the activities. But again, in the enhanced protocol, there's ways to address this issue by doing reconciliations toward the end of the analysis. As you're potentially inputting maybe those fragnets in the schedule, looking at what it does, you can compare that to the next update and explaining essentially those changes to logic and duration. That'll help avoid this concern. It doesn't always consider chronological order of delays. It could in some situation if it's performed again using the enhanced methodologies or more accurately. If you document the way you perform the analysis for the multi-base, even for the single, and you explain that it's chronologically, that you're actually putting the issues on a stepwise fashion, that then you would alleviate some of the issues, some of the concerns there. Now I'm always trying to think of the other side. If I'm representing the owner and receiving this 3.6 and 3.7, sometimes it's not as straightforward. It's not clear, from the overall representation of things, how the fragnets were inserted in the schedule. And as I mentioned, finally, it's sensitive to the order of fragnet and the logic insertion. So if you want to avoid that again, and you're actually performing that analysis, I would maybe consider changing the order to see what it does. And a way I do it actually, instead of necessarily recopying and rechanging the order, is to do a global insertion at the beginning, potentially, of all the issues, whether that be with a single network or multiple, and then zeroing out every time I'm testing the model. So at the beginning, I'm zeroing out all the fragnets for all the issues, and then looking at, that should give me the initial schedule. And then I'm starting to input the durations that represent my fragnet, one issue at a time, chronologically. And I might change the order of such just to see, what that does to the model. So there's some things to consider as you're doing the modeling. It's a little more, obviously, if you're doing it, trying to stay away from being biased, then it might be a little more of a lengthier endeavor. And then you have the last one, which is the subtractive logic, the as-built but for, or the, generally called the as-built but for. It could be called, in other situations, the but for analysis, or things like that. And so essentially that starts with an as-built network. Now, again, if you don't have an as-built network, an as-built schedule, this methodology is going to be harder to perform. And removing issues or delay activities, or reducing durations of activities, those durations representing the delays from that as-built schedule, rerun the schedule to try to see, but for that delay, what would the schedule look like in terms of completion date. The concept generally is easy to understand, and it relies upon the history of actual events, which is an advantage, given that, of course, as a condition, you have to have that actual events available. It could also be implemented without having baseline schedule or contemporaneous schedule updates, but it does require high technical skill and expertise to be able to implement it. There's a lot of coding involved, especially when the schedules are massive and so forth. It is perceived as an after the fact reconstruction that doesn't consider what happened throughout the project in terms of how logic changed and how the critical path shifted. And especially if there are variation between as-built critical path and schedule update proactive critical path. It involves reconstructing the actual schedule, which is actually very fact and labor intensive and time intensive. So that's something to keep in mind. And some people could argue that it might be subject to unintended manipulation as well, because it might be also sensitive to the order in which you remove certain activities. So those are essentially a summary of some consideration, some strength of methodologies, when to use them, when to use the specific methodology. But again, I want to, as a conclusion, note that each claim is really unique in that it deals again with different type of contractual requirement. It deals with what type of legal jurisdiction and what type of dispute step you're in. So choosing that method depends on multiple factors. So we walk through those factors, the biggest ones being contractual requirement, data availability and source availability, the setting of the issue, is it in negotiation, is it in mediation, litigation, and so forth, and other factors. But at the end of the day, something to keep in mind is that any analysis method will depend, no matter how reliable and no matter how well it's implemented, will depend on the data that is used. If it's flawed, the methodology and the analysis will be flawed. So keep that in mind. Start with the validation and rectification and potentially reconstruction of any type of source data that you have, and then move on to performing the schedule analysis. And of course, the accuracy of the schedules that are used in the delay analysis, their validation protocols, the understanding of their limitation, addressing those limitations. If you know of a certain limitation of a method, maybe addressing that issue in your report or whatever, your mechanism of delivering that type of outcome. Addressing it in the sense of, what have you done as an expert to try to alleviate or avoid that limitation? And the analyst, obviously, the hope is to achieve the faithful reflection of the facts, is go after the truth using contemporaneous project information. And keep in mind, if you need to use multiple methodology for sanity purposes or for understanding and trying to stick to facts, that's an option for you as well. All right, with that, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate the attention. I'm going to look at questions here in a bit.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Nour, for detailed explanations about this topic. I think I welcome everyone for a brief Q&A. If you have further clarification questions, can you unmute yourself or type in our chat box? I think at the chat box, no further questions, but as I review it?
I think there
Anybody?
was one question that I saw, which actually is a good question in the as-built but for how to conduct the but-for analysis in case we have several events resulting from both parties' risks. So that's essentially similar to the impact to DAS plan. You first have to understand, where those issues are in the schedule. And that's where your coding exercise come in play. That's it, especially if you're using native formats. And again, you can't really do an as-built but-for with no native schedules. So if you have P6 or MS project schedules, you can start by first coding activities that represent their owner caused delays or their contractor caused delays. That helps you as you're looking at maybe isolating and classifying those activities as a first step. And then your idea is you have to go to a certain backwards, essentially, in that as-built schedule for those activities that have been delayed because you've looked at contemporaneous documents. You've also compared those activities durations potentially to schedule updates or baseline schedule in the past. So while it doesn't necessarily require a baseline schedule, if you have a baseline schedule, that will be a good source of information. So let's assume we're talking about the earlier the issue with delivery of material, which is the contractor's issue, and the issue of design approval, which is the owner's issue. So you have those two activities in the as-built. One has a 20-day duration, the contractor's delivery issue. Oh, sorry, not probably going to be 100-day duration. And the other issue, let's say, is it took the owner 120 days to approve the design. So what you do is try to figure out what has been the plan for those scopes of work and activities. You have to answer that question. If everything went perfectly fine, how long would it have taken the contractor to get that material to the site? And typically you either base that on, correspondence, general information on the project, but most importantly, if you have that available, you base it on your either baseline, summary-based baseline, schedule updates at the beginning of the project. So at the beginning of the project, you need to answer the question, if everything went well, how long should that activity taken? So if it, let's say for the delivery material is 50 days. So that means that initially the activity should have been done in 50 days, ended up being done in 100. So what you do is either you replace actually the activity or reduce that duration to that 50 days. Rerun the schedule. What does that do to that as-built? Does it actually reduce it or bring back the completion date by 50 days? Or, it doesn't impact the schedule at all? Or what is the result? Then you document it. You go to the owner issue. Initially, based on the contract, that's something you can find in the contract. How long should have the owner figured out, or should have the owner have the time to review and approve the schedule? Those information are likely in the contract. It's a submittal. It usually takes them, let's say, 60 days, but it ended up taking them 120. Same exercise. You either replace that activity, zero out the delayed one, or you reduce the duration of that specific activity from 120 to 60, rerun the schedule, and so forth. So we go through for every issue. And again, there are a lot of challenges with this one as well. That's why it's a little more complex in my mind, is the order of such, reducing of durations or deletion of delay activities. So in sometimes the activity that represents delay is the initial activity, but has a delay duration to it. So the example of delivery was supposed to be 50, ended up 100. The contractor didn't really separate the original duration from the actual duration. They just extended the duration. In other situations, you might find actual impact activities in the schedule. Those one you zero out. So an impact activity that says, for example, the change to the design due to the client's or the owner's change order number something. So, but for that change order that adjusted the design, which that means we want to zero out that activity, what would have been that completion date? And you kind of go through that exercise documenting your result as you go. I hope that answers
Okay,
the
there is
question.
one question here. So,
Yeah.
what is the difference between as-built schedule and updated schedule?
So an as-built schedule, and it depends on the situation. Generally, a general definition of an as-built schedule is the last schedule. That's the most known one. The last schedule of the project that documents the actual durations, actual start and completion date about the activities. That's the last update, if you will, that documents the actual condition of how the project was built. Now, if you're talking about as-built network, as you're looking at, for example, Windows analyses or something like that, an as-built network could be an update. In that specific window, an as-built network could be, let's say it's the first month, it's the baseline, first month of the project. The as-built network is going to be the baseline schedule. The as-built network for that Windows analysis is going to be that schedule update number 1.